This is my true story. I spent my whole life working, saving, and sacrificing for my son. I thought age would bring me peace, but instead, it brought me humiliation. One evening, after a lifetime of giving, I found myself locked out of the kitchen by the very boy I once starved to feed. My stomach was empty, but the cruelty cut deeper than hunger. That night, I decided I would never be humiliated again. What I did next changed everything. Before I share it, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And don't forget to subscribe. A father's life is often measured not in what he keeps, but in what he gives away. My entire youth and strength were spent building a life that my son would one day inherit. I worked long days in factories where the air was heavy with dust, my hands blistered from endless labor, my body aching under the weight of machines and tools. When others rested, I pressed forward, saving every coin I could. I skipped comforts, ignored my own health at times, and placed every bit of my energy into creating stability so that my son would never have to endure the same hunger and hardship that shaped me. From the moment he was born, I promised myself that he would not know the struggles I had known. When he cried at night, I held him close, even when exhaustion threatened to close my eyes. When he grew older, I sacrificed meals to ensure he had enough on his plate, smiling through the emptiness in my stomach just to see him nourished and content. His education became my mission. I worked double shifts, pawned cherished belongings, and stretched every paycheck to cover school fees, books, and uniforms. I watched him walk into classrooms wearing shoes I could barely afford, my chest swelling with pride, telling myself that one day he would look back and thank me. As the years went by, his needs grew, and so did my sacrifices. He wanted more than just food and education. He wanted to fit in with his peers, to have what they had: a bicycle, new clothes, gadgets, and later, a car. Each request felt like a mountain before me, but I climbed it. I borrowed when I had nothing left to give, took loans with interest I could barely manage, just to see his smile. I told myself these sacrifices would one day come back as respect, as love, as gratitude. When he married, I paid for the wedding, covering costs that he proudly claimed as his own achievements. I handed him money for the down payment of his house, ensuring he and his wife had a roof to call their own. And when debts came knocking, as they often did due to his reckless spending, I was there again, quietly paying them off to protect his reputation, to keep his life standing tall. Each time, I assured myself that one day, when I grew old and weak, he would remember these acts and return them with kindness. I even built savings, deposits, and investments not for myself, but for him. I imagined a future where he would inherit everything, where my work would ensure his children, my grandchildren, would live with security and opportunity. The wealth I built was not extravagant, but it was steady. Every account, every bond, every investment was a piece of me, a reflection of years sacrificed at the altar of fatherhood. I believed money tied us not just in obligation, but in love, because I thought he would understand the price I had paid to build it. But I was wrong. Instead of gratitude, my son's heart grew colder as mine grew weaker. Instead of loyalty, he gave me distance. And instead of respect, he gave me cruelty. He forgot the hunger I endured, the debts I carried, the nights I spent working while he slept peacefully. In his eyes, all of it faded. And as I aged, as my hair turned gray and my back bent under the weight of time, I realized the wealth I had built did not bind us in love. It bound me to him in chains. I had given him everything, expecting love in return. But what awaited me instead was humiliation. Disrespect never arrives all at once. It seeps in quietly, like cracks spreading through old walls until the whole structure weakens. At first, my son's cruelty came in ways so small that I almost convinced myself they were nothing. A sigh when I asked him a question. A rolled eye when I offered advice. A dismissive tone when I shared a memory from my past. These were tiny daggers hidden in daily life, and though they pierced, I told myself not to take them to heart. I reminded myself that young men are often impatient, that stress from work and marriage might explain his harshness. But deep down, I felt the shift. He no longer looked at me as a father who had given him everything. He looked at me as an old man occupying space in his house. The conversations we once shared over meals turned into silence, broken only by his sharp orders or his wife's uneasy laughter at his dismissive jokes. I began to notice that whenever friends or relatives visited, he treated me like an afterthought. I was no longer introduced with pride but ignored, sometimes even mocked with comments about my age or my habits. He enjoyed painting me as outdated, slow, and irrelevant, and others followed his lead with awkward chuckles. I lowered my head and stayed quiet, hoping it would pass. It did not. The small insults grew bolder. He began using me as though I were a servant in his home. If the floor needed sweeping, he would toss the broom toward me. If plates were left on the table, he would tell me to clear them as though my hands existed for no other purpose. His words carried no warmth, only command. Each task he handed down was not spoken with respect, but with the authority of a master addressing someone beneath him. What cut deeper was how quickly his wife adapted to his tone. At first, she looked uncomfortable when he ordered me around, sometimes even offering to help. But over time, she learned to follow his example. She began leaving her dishes for me, sighing with annoyance if I didn't move quickly enough. They had begun to see me not as family, but as free labor, a shadow in the house who existed only to serve their comfort. Independence, something I had always cherished, was slowly stripped away from me. He began restricting my freedom inside the very home I helped secure. If I wanted to go into the kitchen, he would question why. If I sat too long in the living room, he would ask me to move so he and his friends could have space. Even when I stepped outside for air, he would lock the doors behind me, forcing me to wait until someone remembered I was still there. It was as though he was training me to accept that the house was no longer mine in any sense, not even in spirit. At night, when I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, I replayed the changes over and over. I thought of the boy I had raised, the boy who once clung to my hand at school gates, who once cried for me when he was scared. How had that boy become this man? How had he lost every shred of respect for the father who had bled to make him who he was? My heart broke slowly, piece by piece, each day bringing a new wound. And though I endured it silently, telling myself that patience was the way of fathers, a storm was building inside me. Because I could sense it, this was not the end of his cruelty, it was only the beginning. Cruelty has many faces, but hunger is its sharpest edge. The night that broke me was not marked by shouting or fists. It was marked by silence, the sound of a key turning in a lock, and the hollow ache of an empty stomach. I had endured insults before. I had endured mockery, dismissal, and commands that stripped me of dignity. But when my own son denied me food, the very thing I had starved myself to provide for him when he was a boy, it pierced deeper than anything else he had ever done. It was late evening when it happened. The smell of dinner lingered in the air, rich and warm, reminding me of the meals I once provided for him with my own hands. I had gone to the kitchen quietly, as I often did, waiting until they had finished eating so I could take whatever scraps remained. It had become routine, them feasting while I sat in my room, then me slipping in afterward to eat what was left. Even that humiliation I had learned to endure. But that night, the routine changed. As I reached for the kitchen door, I found it locked. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Perhaps his wife had turned the key by accident. I knocked gently, calling out, hoping someone would answer. Instead, my son appeared from the hallway, his eyes cold, his expression sharp with disdain. He didn't shout, he didn't whisper. He simply said the words that will never leave me. "You eat too much for someone who does nothing. Go hungry." And then he walked away. The key remained in the lock, sealing the door, sealing away food, sealing away dignity. I stood there frozen, my stomach aching, my heart burning with shame. My hands trembled against the doorknob as though my age had made me weak, but it wasn't age, it was betrayal. The boy I had once fed from my own plate now told me I was unworthy of food in my old age. The man who once cried in my arms when he was hungry had now left me hungry on purpose. I sat outside the locked kitchen, the smell of their dinner still heavy in the air, taunting me with every breath. My stomach growled, but the humiliation was louder. My body was weak, but my heart was weaker. I lowered myself to the cold floor, curling against the wall like a stranger in my own home. Hunger gnawed at me, but what gnawed harder was memory. Memory of nights I skipped meals so he could eat. Memory of times I worked late shifts so he would never go to bed hungry. Memory of saving coins in jars just to buy him bread. The silence of the house grew unbearable. I could hear them laughing in the living room, the clink of glasses, the sound of a television playing, the casual noise of comfort. And there I was, locked away from the kitchen like an animal, denied the simplest human need by the very person who owed his life to me. Hours passed. The pain in my stomach twisted into knots, but worse was the pain in my chest. Every insult I had endured before, every command, every dismissal, they all came rushing back, piling on top of this moment. This was not just about food. This was about power. He wanted me weak. He wanted me silent. He wanted me to know I had no place left in his life, no value left in his eyes. When the laughter finally died down and the lights dimmed, I remained where I was, too humiliated to move. I did not knock again. I did not beg. I simply sat in the dark, a father reduced to nothing by the son he had raised. My hands clutched my stomach, but what ached most was my heart. And though my body grew weaker with each passing hour, something else grew stronger inside me. Resolve. That night, locked out of the kitchen, denied food like a beggar, I realized I would never again allow him to hold such power over me. He thought the kitchen was his kingdom, that by turning a key he could starve me into silence. But he had forgotten where the true keys lay, in the accounts, the savings, the investments. The kitchen was his. But the future? That was still mine to take. The body can endure hunger for a while, but the heart struggles to survive humiliation. That night, after my son locked the kitchen and left me hungry, I sat in silence, my back against the cold wall, my stomach twisting and my mind replaying every memory that had led to this point. Hunger gnawed at me like sharp teeth, but it was nothing compared to the ache in my chest. It wasn't the lack of food that broke me. It was the cruelty of being denied it by the very boy I once starved to feed. I remembered the nights of my youth, when I worked 2 shifts in a row and came home with only a small loaf of bread. I would break it into pieces, giving him the larger share and taking only crumbs for myself. I remembered boiling water and adding salt, pretending it was soup, so he could feel like he was eating a meal while I drank only the broth. I remembered walking miles in the rain to borrow money so he could have lunch money for school, while I went without. These memories burned like fire in my mind as I sat hungry in a house filled with food that was locked away from me. The silence of the night wrapped around me like chains. I listened to the faint hum of the refrigerator on the other side of the locked door, knowing it held more than enough to fill my stomach, yet it was forbidden to me. I listened to the faint sound of my son's laughter in his room, muffled through the walls, sharp as knives in my ears. He laughed, and I starved. He slept peacefully, and I curled on the hard floor with an empty stomach. I tried to close my eyes and rest, but each time I drifted, the same thought jolted me awake. How could he do this to me? I had given him everything. I had built his entire life with my bare hands. I had shielded him from hunger, from cold, from shame. And now, in the years when I needed only a little compassion, he gave me nothing but starvation and mockery. The betrayal cut deeper than hunger ever could. By morning, my body was weak, but my mind was sharper. The hunger remained, but it became something more. It became fuel for thought, fuel for reflection. I realized that this was not a single act of cruelty. It was the final stage of a long road of disrespect. He had mocked me, ordered me, dismissed me, and now he had starved me. Each step had been a test, and I had endured them all in silence. But now silence felt like death. To remain quiet would be to surrender completely, to allow myself to be erased in my own son's home. I thought about every sacrifice I had made, the debts I carried, the meals I skipped, the bones I wore thin with work. I thought about the house he lived in, the car he drove, the money he flaunted, the life he called his own. All of it came from me. Without my labor, without my sacrifices, he would have had nothing. And yet he dared to call me worthless, dared to lock the kitchen, dared to leave me hungry. The pain of that night hardened into something new. Resolve. If he believed I was powerless, he was wrong. If he thought hunger would break me, he misunderstood the man who had survived far worse to build his life. I had given him everything, but I also still held power he had forgotten. The accounts, the savings, the investments, the foundation of his life were still under my name. He thought he had trapped me with a lock, but the real keys had always belonged to me. That night of silent suffering became the turning point. Hunger had humbled me, but betrayal had awakened me. I realized then that I would not die in humiliation, waiting for scraps from a son who treated me as nothing. I would rise, not with fists or anger, but with the same weapon I had used all my life: responsibility, control, and determination. My suffering would end. His would soon begin. My son thought locking the kitchen gave him power. He believed that by denying me food, he could remind me of my weakness, that he could starve me into silence and prove I was dependent on him. But what he forgot was that true power doesn't come from locks or keys. True power comes from ownership, from control of the things that cannot be taken with a single turn of the wrist. What he had in his hands was a door. What I had in mine was his future. For years, I had quietly managed the family's accounts, the savings I had built through decades of labor, the investments I had nurtured carefully to grow like trees from the seeds of my sweat. Every deposit, every bond, every certificate bore my name. I had given him access, yes, bank cards, logins, and permissions, but I never transferred the roots. I trusted him, or rather, I wanted to trust him. I told myself that one day he would handle these accounts with care and maturity, that the wealth I had built would be the safety net for his children. But he treated it as his entitlement, never realizing that he was living not on his own strength, but on borrowed power. When he locked me out of the kitchen, he thought I was trapped. He thought his control over the house gave him authority over me. But the truth was simple. He had the house, but I had the keys to the empire. He had the kitchen, but I had the vault. He thought I was powerless, but in reality, he was nothing without me. His cars, his comforts, his nights of laughter with friends, all of it was built on foundations he didn't own. He strutted as though he were the provider, but he was merely a tenant of the wealth I had allowed him to touch. I remembered the day I first placed his name on the accounts. I did it out of love, out of trust, believing it was time to pass the torch. I wanted him to feel secure, to know that everything I had built was his inheritance. But I never relinquished control completely. Some part of me, perhaps the wiser part, kept the roots in my grip. And now, after he starved me in my own home, I understood why. He had forgotten that none of it was truly his. He had mistaken privilege for ownership, arrogance for independence. That night, as I sat in hunger, I realized the depth of his blindness. He thought denying me food proved his strength, but it only reminded me of my own. Hunger had taught me resilience long before he was born. I had endured nights with nothing, years with scraps, days where survival depended on grit alone. If he thought I would break now, he was mistaken. I had not survived poverty and struggle just to be erased by my own blood. He forgot the simple truth. The money he used to mock me was mine. The roof he laughed under was built from my labor. The food he locked away was bought with my earnings. Without me, he would have been nothing but a boy in rags, and without me, he would soon return to nothing again. He thought cruelty made him powerful, but in truth, it made him careless. He thought I had grown too old to act, too weak to fight back. But the greatest power I still held was not in my body. It was in the paper, the signatures, the numbers in the accounts that carried my name. I looked at the future clearly for the first time. He wanted me weak, invisible, humiliated. But I still had the power to decide what he ate, what he drove, what he owned, and what he lost. And unlike him, I didn't need to lock doors to prove it. I only needed to sign a paper, make a call, and everything he thought belonged to him would vanish. That was the power he forgot. There comes a moment in every man's life when silence becomes heavier than action. That moment came for me after the night of hunger, when I lay in bed with an empty stomach but a mind full of clarity. For years, I had endured his insults, his dismissals, his commands, and finally, his cruelty of locking me away from food. I had tolerated each act because I told myself I was his father, and fathers must endure for their children. But as dawn crept through the curtains, painting the room in pale light, I realized endurance was no longer noble. It was surrender, and I refused to surrender anymore. The decision formed slowly but firmly, like steel hardening in fire. I would not shout. I would not curse. I would not raise a hand against him. Instead, I would use the one thing he never expected me to use, the financial power he had forgotten I still held. My son believed he controlled me because he controlled the house. But houses are only walls. Kitchens are only rooms. Real control lies in the accounts, the savings, the investments. And all of those were still mine. That morning, I rose early, my body weak from hunger, but my will sharper than it had been in years. I gathered every document I had carefully kept, account numbers, bank details, legal papers. Each sheet was proof that while he may have locked me out of the kitchen, he had never locked me out of what truly mattered. My hands trembled as I placed them into a folder, not from weakness, but from the weight of what I was about to do. This was no small act. This was the breaking of chains, the end of humiliation, the reclaiming of my dignity. I thought back to every sacrifice I had made for him. The meals I had skipped, the debts I had carried, the sleepless nights I had endured. Each memory burned like fuel, reminding me that this was not betrayal. This was justice. I was not stealing from him. I was reclaiming what was always mine, what I had built with my sweat and blood. He had taken my love and twisted it into chains. Now, I would take his arrogance and turn it into ashes. The decision was clear. I would drain every account, revoke his access, and disappear. I would vanish from his life completely, leaving him not just without money, but without the comfort of knowing where I was. He would never again have the chance to starve me, mock me, or call me worthless. He would be left with nothing but regret, while I would finally live in peace, eating meals with dignity, sleeping without fear of insult. I did not decide out of anger. Anger fades. I decided out of resolve. Resolve lasts. My son had forgotten who I was. He thought I was an old man clinging to scraps. But I was still the man who had built everything he enjoyed. I was still the signature on the papers, the name on the accounts, the foundation beneath his entire life. And with one decision, I could erase the empire he thought was his. So, I did not hesitate. I made the choice. Tomorrow, I would call the bank. Tomorrow, I would drain everything. Tomorrow, I would disappear. Execution is where decision transforms into reality, where thought becomes action, and where silence finally finds its voice. The morning after my resolve hardened, I dressed carefully. Not in fine clothes, but in the kind of plain outfit that would draw no attention. I carried with me the folder, thick with documents, each one a piece of my life's work, each one a reminder that while he thought me powerless, I still held the strings that kept his world together. My body felt light with hunger, but heavy with determination. I knew what I had to do, and nothing could stop me now. The first step was the bank. I walked in slowly, shoulders straight, eyes forward, as though I were not a father humiliated in his own home, but a man in control of his own destiny. The clerks greeted me politely, and though my hands trembled slightly, I steadied them with purpose. I asked to speak with the manager, someone who had known me for years, someone who had seen the deposits, the bonds, the savings grow under my name. He led me to his office, his eyes curious but respectful, and I placed the folder on his desk. Inside were instructions I had prepared the night before. Revoke every secondary access, remove my son's permissions, and transfer the entirety of my accounts into a new private account under my name only. Bonds to be liquidated, investments to be withdrawn, certificates to be cashed, nothing left behind. I wanted every cent, every thread of power drawn back into my hands. The manager asked if I was certain. I told him yes, my voice steady. He processed the request, his fingers moving quickly over the keyboard, his face unreadable but professional. Papers were printed, signed, stamped. With each signature, I felt chains fall away. With each stamp, I felt strength return to me. Hours later, it was done. The accounts were drained, the permissions revoked, the bonds cleared. The future that my son thought belonged to him now rested quietly in my new account, safe, untouchable, beyond his reach. I left the bank not as a man broken by hunger, but as a man reborn by justice. But I did not stop there. I went to the investment office, ensuring every remaining share was liquidated. I went to the bond issuer, collecting the cash value. I left no loose ends, no doors open for him to claw back what he had mocked me for. By the time the sun began to sink, everything was complete. Legally, securely, permanently, his savings had vanished, not stolen, but reclaimed by the man who had built them. When I returned home that evening, the house felt different. I walked quietly to my room, my folder thinner now, but my heart stronger. My son still believed he had power over me, still believed the lock on the kitchen proved his dominance. But I knew what awaited him. The next time he reached for his bank card, the truth would hit him like a storm. The man he called a beggar had emptied his fortune without raising his voice. I did not celebrate. There was no need for shouting, no need for triumph. My justice was silent, deliberate, complete. While he slept, dreaming of his false control, I had dismantled his empire piece by piece. And when morning came, he would wake not as the master of the house, but as a man with nothing left. The execution was complete, the chains were broken, and I was ready for the next step, to vanish, leaving him to choke on the hunger of his own arrogance. Fallout does not arrive with warning. It erupts suddenly, like a storm breaking over calm seas. The very next morning, I heard it begin. My son stormed into the kitchen, tossing open drawers, slamming cupboards, his voice sharp with anger. At first, I thought it was his usual arrogance spilling into the day, but then I heard the sound that confirmed everything, the curse of a man whose card had just been declined. His wife's voice joined his, rising in panic as she asked what was happening. The empire he thought untouchable had begun to crumble before his very eyes. I remained in my room, silent, listening. He shouted about frozen accounts, about banks refusing his calls, about transactions bouncing back. He accused the bank of mistakes, his voice thick with rage, but beneath it I could hear fear. He tried again and again, dialing numbers, slamming his phone on the table, demanding explanations. Each attempt ended the same way, with nothing. His money was gone. The cards he had once flaunted, the accounts he had boasted of, had all been reduced to zeros. By noon, his fury filled the house. He slammed doors, shouted at his wife, cursed the world for betraying him. He did not yet know that it was I, the man he called a beggar, who had taken back what was always mine. He only knew that the life he had built on arrogance was collapsing. I could hear the fear in his voice as he muttered about bills he could not pay, loans that now had no cover, friends who would abandon him the moment they smelled weakness. Neighbors began to notice. He stormed out of the house, shouting into his phone in the street, his face red with anger, his words carried on the air. People stopped to watch. Whispers spread quickly. The man who had once strutted proudly was now unraveling in front of everyone. His friends, the same ones who had laughed when he mocked me, kept their distance. Some even smirked, enjoying the downfall of a man who had built his pride on shallow foundations. When he returned home that evening, his rage had turned to desperation. He scoured drawers for cash, searched old files, begged his wife for answers she did not have. I watched quietly from the hallway as he tore through the house like a man drowning, reaching for anything to keep himself afloat. His wife's face was pale, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and disgust. For the first time, she seemed to see him for what he was, a man who had mocked his father, starved him, and now had nothing to show for all his cruelty. The most bitter part of the fallout was this. The man who had locked the kitchen to starve me now could not buy food for himself. That evening, when he tried to order dinner, his card was declined again. His rage boiled, but there was no one to save him. I sat quietly at the table with a simple plate of food I had bought with my own cash, eating slowly, savoring not just the meal, but the dignity. He glared at me, but I did not flinch. He knew deep down that the balance had shifted. The fallout spread further over the next few days. Calls came from creditors demanding payments. Friends stopped answering. His wife grew colder, her patience dissolving as quickly as his accounts. The man who once mocked me as a beggar was now begging for time, for mercy, for answers he could not find. And I, the father he thought powerless, no longer felt the weight of humiliation. He had locked me out of the kitchen. Now, I had locked him out of his future. Disappearance is not running away. It is choosing peace over noise, dignity over humiliation, and silence over endless battles. By the time the fallout of my actions had stripped my son of everything, I knew my part in his story was finished. There was nothing left for me in that house except the memory of insults, the echo of locked doors, and the bitterness of hunger. I had drained his savings, reclaimed what was mine, and watched his arrogance crumble into panic. The final step was to vanish, to walk away and never look back. I began with preparation. I packed only what I needed. A single suitcase with a few changes of clothes, some personal documents, and the small keepsakes that mattered to me. Not valuables, but memories. Things that reminded me of the man I once was before humiliation stripped me bare. I left behind everything else, for I had no desire to carry the weight of a house that had turned into a prison. I carried only freedom. Before dawn, I walked out quietly. The house was still, the silence broken only by the faint hum of appliances, the same ones I had been denied access to. I did not look at the kitchen door, the symbol of my humiliation. I had already taken back my dignity. I had no need for revenge beyond what I had done. As I stepped into the cool morning air, I felt a lightness I had not known in years. My steps were slow but firm, each one carrying me further from pain. At the station, I bought a train ticket with cash, leaving no trace behind. I boarded without hesitation, settling into a seat near the window. As the train pulled away, I watched the landscape change, fields and towns rushing past, each mile placing distance between me and the life that had betrayed me. For the first time in decades, I felt free. From the train, I moved to a bus, then to another city, and finally to the airport. I purchased a one-way ticket under my own name, but with the new account details I had secured. The money was mine now, untouchable, safe. When I boarded the plane, I looked out at the horizon and told myself this: I am not escaping. I am beginning again. The flight was long, but my mind was calm. I thought not of what I had left behind, but of the life ahead. A life where no one could mock me, starve me, or call me worthless. A life where I would eat meals in peace, sleep without fear, and wake without chains. By the time I landed in a distant country, my decision was complete. I found a small place to rent, modest but quiet, surrounded by people who did not know my name or my history. I opened my new account, withdrew enough to live comfortably, and felt a sense of dignity wash over me. For the first time, I ate a meal not as a man waiting for scraps, but as a man who had chosen his own future. Back in the house I had left, I knew chaos reigned. My son would search, would curse, would rage, but he would not find me. He would not call me. He would not starve me again. I had disappeared not out of fear, but out of strength. My life was now mine alone. And so, I vanished. Not as a beggar, not as a servant, not as a burden, but as a man who had reclaimed his dignity through silence, through patience, and through truth. Justice, when it finally arrives, is rarely loud. It does not always crash through doors or echo with applause. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the way a man eats a meal without shame, in the way he sleeps without fear, in the way he looks at the morning sun and feels no chains around his heart. That was my justice. I did not raise my hand. I did not shout, threaten, or curse. I simply reclaimed what was mine, and I walked away. My son thought he had broken me by locking a kitchen door, but I showed him that the true locks were never in his hands. They were in mine. Each day in my new life became a small victory. I would sit at a table with a plate of food, and every bite tasted like dignity restored. I would close my eyes at night. the bed soft beneath me, and sleep deeply, not haunted by hunger or insult. The silence in my new home was not the silence of humiliation, but the silence of peace. I was no longer the man begging for respect. I was the man who had taken it back without a word. I thought of him sometimes, of course. I imagined his face when the bank cards declined, his rage when the accounts were empty, his confusion when he realized I had disappeared forever. I imagined the emptiness in his stomach, the same emptiness he had forced upon me. But unlike him, I did not smile at the thought of his suffering. My justice was not about watching him starve. It was about ensuring I would never starve again. Not from food, not from love, not from dignity. My son had called me a burden, treated me like a beggar, stripped me of honor. But he forgot that the man he mocked was the same man who had built his foundation, paid his debts, and filled his stomach in the years when he had nothing. He thought age made me powerless. He thought cruelty made him strong. He forgot that strength is not in cruelty. Strength is in sacrifice, in endurance, in patience, and in the moment when patience finally ends. Justice for me was not revenge. Justice was balance. He locked me out of the kitchen. I locked him out of his future. He tried to erase my dignity. I erased his false pride. He thought I was trapped. I proved I was free. My disappearance was not escape. It was victory. Because in leaving him behind, I carried nothing but peace. And in staying behind, he was left with nothing but regret. Final thought. He locked me out of the kitchen. I locked him out of his future. And while he was left with hunger and shame, I walked into freedom with dignity on my plate.